When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr, and we spend an hour each week devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to African people and to others trying to build a better society. Very excited today to have with us an author, a scholar, an investigative journalist, and someone who is fighting to make a better world, one word at a time. Back in February 2018, I had the pleasure of being in an audience at the Howard University School of Law with this sister. We were there for her to unveil her book, We Face the Dawn. Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, and the legal team that dismantled Jim Crow. These are two graduates of the Howard University School of Law. And at the time, we said, we'll have to get you back. We'll have to bring you over and talk to the undergraduate students. And how can we get this book and this message, this story out to the world? Well, of course, between 2018, when the book came out, and where we are now in 2022, we suffered a whole pandemic. We also opened up a whole virtual universe of dialogue. And so without further ado, we're going to bring to the Black Table and introduce to a whole new range of viewers all over the world, Margaret Edds, journalist, and native Kentuckian, right, Margaret? Yeah, I think
that's right. Harlan County, bloody Harlan.
It amazed me because, in reading about your background, I realized, you spent, we were in Nashville at the same time. I was born and raised in Nashville, and I realized you worked for the Union, huh?
Oh, wow. What part of Nashville?
Oh, well, I'm
from Madison.
Oh, you're in Madison, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, the way the city has expanded now, people don't make the difference. When I was growing up, that's like way out in Nashville. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Carr, Greg.
No, Greg.
Very nice to be here.
No question. Glad so much. Very glad to have you. It's so funny. A few weeks ago, we had Professor Toyin Falola from the University of Texas on, and his phone rang while we were talking. And of course, that's just evidence that people are always trying to get in touch with him, and they always try to get in touch with you. So if you don't mind, could you walk us a little bit through your life journey? I mean, how you got into journalism, some of the ways you were apprenticed, and you even went to school in Tennessee, right? Before coming to end up in Richmond, you and your husband. Could you talk to us a little bit?
I grew up in Nashville in a very segregated era, I guess. 1950s and early 1960s, and I went to a little school in East Tennessee Wesleyan College, and then moved on from there to a career in journalism where my eyes began to be open. A new book that I've written that we'll talk about later, the title is What the Eyes Can't See, and I realized that there was a lot that I did not see at that point in time. As I think a sort of turning point for me was in 1985. I had a Alicia Patterson Fellowship, which is a National Journalism Fellowship, to travel around the South and look at the results of the Voting Rights Act. And that was, of course, at its 20th anniversary. And I went to places like Atlanta, where much change had taken place and Black leaders were running the city. And I went to places like Sunflower County, Mississippi, where there was a Black majority population and essentially no elected officials. And so that was a really eye-opening time for me. I talked to many people, like SB, others who were just sort of young officials at that point and went on to much larger careers. So from that point on, it was something that I focused on.
Well, of course, for people who might remember, and there may be a few who don't remember, I think Sunflower County is where Fannie Lou Hamer is from, isn't it?
That's right. Yes.
No, I mean to interrupt. Please go on. So, wow.
So at any rate, I had a career in journalism almost entirely with the Virginian Pilot in Norfolk. And I did political writing, and then I went on to start writing some books. And I wrote a book out of that process of traveling around the South and seeing the results of the Voting Rights Act. And then I wrote another book about Doug Wilder when he was elected, of course, the nation's first elected Black governor. A man named Earl Washington Jr., who was on death row in Virginia and turned out to be innocent. I wrote about his case. I wrote another book about my mother, who died when I was 3, and letters that we found from her after the death of my father and her closest sister. And then I came to the book about Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, which was something that I'd been interested in looking at for many years, but just had not had the opportunity to do so. until I retired from the newspaper and could really devote time to that research.
Well, I mean, it sounds like your whole professional career, in fact, including your upbringing and how you were able to weave that back in, it just prepared you for this remarkable work. And of course, Evoke and Doug Wilder, another Howard University graduate, still with us.
Right.
I was amazed, and for folks who are listening, one of the reasons that obviously you were invited to come to Howard to talk about We Face the Dawn, so many of the folk that you write about between, I mean, the names we know, obviously, like Thurgood Marshall, perhaps Charles Hamilton Houston, but Pauli Murray, a name is becoming more known now, and you connect her in many ways. Fascinating. I know we'll maybe get a chance to talk about Odell Walker and some of the things that happened in Virginia. But the fact that you interviewed and got to interview Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Jack Greenberg and so many others, and Oliver Hill himself, although it was very interesting to hear how you talked to Judge Robinson one time, but his ethics prevented him from talking to you. But you may full use of Juan Williams transcript for sure in this book. But I'm wondering, we kind of know at the Howard University School of Law, but unfortunately, generally speaking, not only at Howard, but around the country and the world, we don't understand two things that you really thread through. The importance of Virginia in the civil rights and human rights struggle, and the importance of these Black institutions, whether it be Black school teachers, historically Black colleges. And as you were writing, a name very early on appears, Z. Alexander Luby. And of course, you write about all these cases, the famous restrictive covenant cases, and so many that these lawyers went and argued. Growing up in South Nashville, Z. Alexander Luby actually is the reason that I grew up in the house that I grew up in South Nashville, the one still in our family, when because of restricted covenant, the white man who had sold it to my daddy tried to sell it again to a white man. He went and got Mr. Luby, who stopped the sale in court. So when you write about Z. Alexander Luby, pretty much probably saving Thurgood Marshall's life on that back road in Tennessee,
Right.
it resonated for me. But for everybody watching, We Face the Dawn really traces the history, American history, in this critical period in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then, of course, in the kind of denouement, what happens in the wake. But he tells it through the story of two remarkable people. I wonder, could you introduce to us, and then we'll come back and talk about them more after the break, these two remarkable figures, Oliver Hill Sr. and, of course, the great Spotswood William Robinson III, who has virtually disappeared, if he ever was present, really in the imaginary of American and world history.
Right. Judge Robinson, I keep advocating for him, even in Virginia. Oliver Hill is part of the standards of learning, whatever, but Judge Robinson, but really they were equally great and just iconic figures. Well, to tell you just a little about them, they, of course, both came out of Howard Law School, and the importance of that law school to all that came with these men and many others really cannot be overstated. Charles Hamilton Houston, of course, who created that curriculum and that desire to produce lawyers who would go out and change America. Oliver Hill graduated there in 1933. He was in class with Thurgood Marshall. They were great buddies and rivals at the time. Judge Robinson came 6 years later, and he graduated with the highest, at that point, grade point average. At least that was the reputation in the history of the law school. It was a record that stood for many years, I found.
Absolutely. I should pause and shout out Seth Kroner, who used to be the Howard University archivist. He's no longer there. But you talk about how you tried to track down that story. He still tell that story at Howard that Spot Robinson had the highest GPA until 2003. And also, as you were talking, it made me think about the fact that Charles Houston, I love how you say he wanted the title Vice Dean. And as the legend goes, either because they weren't paying him enough or they weren't paying the faculty enough. But I mean, I love that notion of humility. But Houston is a name we don't know as well, the man who killed Jim Crow. But yeah, so please, let me know. I just wanted to make sure folks knew about those things, because you go in exquisite detail in this book. It really is.
Well, these two men were extremely different. They were both from Richmond, and I think their proximity to Washington and the fact that they could go up to Washington so easily to meet with Marshall and others who would come down from DC, and they would meet at the law school, and they would hammer out all these strategies. So their geography played a role in their importance. But Robert Carter told me that they were the most significant grassroots lawyers that we had, we being the NAACP, anywhere in the South. And I think that's borne out by their personalities in their cases. So they were two very different people. Mr. Hill was this very extroverted sort of alpha male. He was commanding, he was demanding. He really was the face and soul of the civil rights movement in Virginia for many years. And he wound up receiving a Presidential Medal of Freedom and all sorts of awards from the American Bar Association, the National Bar Association. He headed the Virginia chapter of the NAACP for legal arm of that for 20 years, and really was just sort of a moving, driving force in so much that occurred.
You mentioned Robert Carter in passing. Robert Carter I think he was the youngest lawyer on that team that argued Brown versus Board. In the room, if I remember from his memoir, you actually talked to Judge Carter.
That's right, I did, yes, by phone.
Yeah.
But Judge Robinson was a very different figure from Mr. Hill. He was much more reserved. He was really a brilliant man. He was very close to Thurgood Marshall. And in writing about him, when Richard Kruger wrote about the Brown decision, he said that Robinson was really Thurgood Marshall's most valuable all-around associate, because I think Marshall just relied on him to be so meticulous, so accurate in everything that he did. He, of course, became dean of the law school in the early 1960s, and then he went on the federal bench, and he was there for over 20 years, and he eventually became the chief judge of the DC Court of Appeals, which, as we know, is the second most important in the country. And people like Scalia and Bork and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were on that court. He was the chief judge. He once wrote a legal opinion that had 676 footnotes. He was just so meticulous. And Judge Ginsburg told me he was meticulous. That was his biggest problem. So I think sometimes he could take a long time getting his opinions out because he wanted to cover every point in the law. And Stephen Carter, who of course at Yale Law School, told me it really was that he just loved the law so much, and he was fascinated by every detail of it. Carter clerked for Judge Robinson at one point and saw that. And another very cute little story about him, he was so ethical about things and about obeying the law that the two of them left the courthouse late one night to go home, and as they left, Carter just sort of walked across the street, but Judge Robinson went to the corner and waited for the light to change. He was not going to jaywalk, and I think it was that he had spent his life saying that white politicians and lawmakers had to obey the law whether they liked it or not, and that he was not going to take any shortcuts in doing that for himself.
What a personality. It truly is remarkable that in American and world history, we don't know the name Spotswood Robinson like we should. I can see why you spent so long fighting to get that name elevated. We're going to take a break, Margaret, just for a second. And when we come back, we're going to continue this story and really get into the guts of this war that was waged in the 20th century for human freedom here in the United States and in these courtrooms by these two men and the women and men who surrounded them. So we'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table, back in a moment here on the Black Star Network.
Can you believe the nerve of these Republicans? They only want to block progress for our community. They talk about cutting Medicare and Social Security. They played politics with veterans' health care. They voted against the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and funding for our HBCUs, and against lowering prescription drug costs for our seniors. These Republicans keep trying hard to stand in the way, but President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Democrats won't let them. They are delivering for us. The Democratic National Committee is responsible for the content of this advertising.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. My name is Greg Carr. Today we're joined by Margaret Edds, author of a number of books, including We Face the Dawn, Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, and the legal team that dismantled Jim Crow. Margaret, when we left, you were describing Judge Robinson, and one of the most remarkable photographs in the book, in fact, is the picture of him as the chief judge on the Court of Appeals. And you do see Robert Bork and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, Harry Edwards, who ended up, of course, you end up being the president of the American Bar Association. All these folks are sitting there, judges on the Court of Appeals, and Spotswood Robinson is the chief judge. And I can't help but imagine that had it not been for apartheid in this country and racism, that he would have been on the Supreme Court easily. And is it true? I think you're right that he wrote the longest footnote in the history of the federal bench up to that point. Just one footnote. You understand?
That's the reputation that he wrote. Yes.
So when these young men, and of course we talked to Pauli Murray's grandniece a few weeks ago, who talked about her Aunt Pauli, and of course, the story about how Pauli Murray told then faculty member Spotswood Robinson that they're going to end Jim Crow and it's going to be the 14th Amendment, and they made a bet that she had to collect on. But of course, the generation before he had been in those classrooms. Could you talk a little bit about Virginia and the legal strategy that Robinson and Hill undertook to dismantle Jim Crow, particularly as it related to education? You opened the book, in fact, with that famous march, September the 9th, 1948. I mean, talk about a journalistic talent. You really tell that story. Could you open us up to really Virginia and that battleground?
Sure. And just before we get there, I'd like to say one thing. Judge Robinson might have been on the Supreme Court. I think Oliver Hill would have been in Congress. I mean, he really was such a natural political leader, but he just could not get elected in Virginia. In 1948, he did get elected to the Richmond City Council, which was a really remarkable feat, but he was defeated by just a few votes. 2 years later, white leaders all over the city wrote him letters, which are in his papers, saying how disappointed they were because he'd been such an asset and strong leader. And then, of course, that was right before they sort of launched into the strong school desegregation area. And he himself said that a few years after that, he couldn't have been elected dog catcher in Virginia, which I'm sure that's probably true. So when we think about these men, I think there are three reasons that they are so important. One of them is that they were part of this small brotherhood, and it really was pretty much a brotherhood at that point, that met at Howard and sort of devised the legal strategies to attack Jim Crow. The second was the cases that they had, many important cases. Most significantly, I guess, what people know about is one of the cases that was part of Brown v. Board, but many others in transportation and housing and restrictive covenants. And then the third thing was,
I should pause here to raise the name of Irene Morgan, because that Morgan versus Virginia case, a lot of people think about Rosa Parks and them, but when they got into that Morgan versus Virginia, it's such an important, it really opens up eventually what become the Freedom Rides, of course. I mean, I had to always remember Boynton versus Virginia because Amelia Boynton's son was a student at Howard Law School. He was coming home for the holidays. That's where Boynton versus Virginia came from. But a lot of people don't know when you mention transportation, just to give people a tease and please get We Face the Dawn, because it really is a history of all those legal battles. I didn't mean to interrupt you. So you're about to go to the third one. So
right. So the third one was what you started with, and that is the work that they did on looking at the disparities in Black and white education. Marshall tapped Robinson to take a year to go around the state, just looking at the disparities in Black and white schools and recording that. And then out of that, he and Oliver Hill and Martin, who was their third partner, who really does not get the credit that he was due, in part because he died at an early age, but he was really a very strong defense attorney and was very intricately involved. At any rate, they then began to file motions and cases in these school divisions, pointing out the disparities in Black and white education. Black teachers were greatly underpaid over white teachers. Transportation didn't exist for Black children in many places. School buildings were extremely deficient. It came nowhere close to meeting the Plessy standard of separate but equal. And at one point, they had actions pending in 75 Virginia localities. And out of that, they established a very clear record to show that it was going to be essentially impossible to achieve the Plessy standard. Because even when they won in court, which they sometimes did, in Pulaski County, amazingly, a federal appeals court judge upheld their argument that black children should not have to be bussed out of the county in order to get an education. But even when they won those cases, the local officials drug their feet, simply ignored them, whatever. So it formed a real underpinning to say, we are not going to get equal schools this way. We have to go in a new direction. I
want to know here, you write about this, and also, and as you said, you evoke Richard Kruger and simple justice. I think about that battle, that intellectual battle that was taking place at the NAACP as they were arguing about strategies. And I remember was it the Marigold Memorandum, I think, where they're talking about strategies one way or the other. But you write that Spotswood Robinson really pushes Thurgood Marshall on this and say, no, we need to just go after Jim Crow completely, because one of the things Marigold says is, if you will get bogged down. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources to go district by district and try to fight these equalization arguments. And Spotswood Robinson seems to be particularly concerned that tactically might not be the way to go. And eventually they go his way on this. I mean, that's fascinating to hear.
Well, he had been at the forefront of this and had worked the ground level, so he knew it. And he said, I just got to the point where I didn't want to be telling other people how to do these equalization strategies. I was just ready to wash my hands of it. And if we're going to do more of these, then I'm not going to be part of it. So not to say that he was the only person making that argument, but he felt it passionately. And he was certainly one of those who I think was pivotal in moving NAACP in that direction. Interestingly, Hill thought that they should go after residential segregation first. And of course, we can see what's happened today, that even though we have the right to have integrated schools, so many school districts are really out of reach for people who are not of means because they can't afford to live in those districts. So these things are all intertwined, and the attorneys came at them with different perspectives, and but at any rate, the education was where things went first.
And as you talk about that, and again, for law students and legal professionals, they know the names Hurd versus Hodge, Hansberry versus Lee, and of course that Hansberry was Lorraine Hansberry's uncle, actually father. I'm sorry, Carl. I'm thinking her uncle actually worked at Howard. Ian Lil Hansberry, but maybe we can talk a little bit about the role of, as you say, Spotswood Robinson knew them intimately, and Oliver Hill came to know the teachers and the students. That was fascinating. You write about J. Raper Peacock, and I have a copy of his History of Virginia Teachers Association over there in the corner. But these school teachers played this role that is so important, and it's almost disappeared from history, the role of school teachers. Can you talk a little bit about the Black school teachers in Virginia and how they work with them?
Sure. Yes, these people, again, were on the front lines. They knew what was happening, and they were such support for the lawyers. The work that they were doing was so hard, and the public officials in Virginia were going after them tooth and nail, trying to get them disbarred, just going after their livelihoods. I mean, all the time they were fighting for things like Brown v. Board. They were having to fight a rearguard action in Virginia just to protect their own livelihoods. And to have these teachers and education leaders who supported them and stood with them, it was just so important, both from an informational standpoint and just for the morale of that. And of course, the educators who led in this, like Luttrell Palmer down in Newport News, I mean, people who were really premier educators and really known nationally, but when they pushed for something as what we would think of as obvious as equal teacher pay, their contracts were not renewed. So Virginia, likes to say that it did not have the lynchings that some of the more deep South states had, but I think Virginia leaders were very good at breaking the spirits of people. And they would go after the livelihoods, the jobs, the professions of people, and just make life pretty miserable.
That's truly remarkable. We're going to come back in a moment to continue this conversation. When you evoke Luttrell Palmer, is that the father of Lou Palmer, who ends up in Chicago?
It is.
That is remarkable. So everybody in Chicago, he's a legend. Lou Palmer's a legend in Chicago, and I wonder if they know that history, that his father, in fact, is a legend in Virginia, or at least was at that time.
That's right. And Lou Palmer felt that his father's early death was in part attributable to his having lost his job as the principal of his high school that he had built in Newport News, and just the anxiety and tension that came out of that.
But when we come back, maybe we'll get a chance to cover some of that. We hope to have soon my friend and colleague Leslie Fenwick, who has just finished her book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, about what happens to those Black educators in the wake of quote unquote integration. So we'll be back in a moment, Margaret. We'll be back with Margaret Edds, author of We Face the Dawn and many other books. And we are going to continue our conversation here on the Black Star Network. Back in a moment.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Can you believe the nerve of these Republicans? They only want to block progress for our community. They talk about cutting Medicare and Social Security. They played politics with veterans' health care. They voted against the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and funding for our HBCUs, and against lowering prescription drug costs for our seniors. These Republicans keep trying hard to stand in the way, but President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Democrats won't let them. They are delivering for us. The Democratic National Committee is responsible for the content of this advertising.
When we invest in ourselves, our glow, our vision, our vibe, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Star Network, and remember to support the Black Star Network and all of its endeavors, all of its programming. Truly a remarkable platform. In the words of Lou Palmer of Chicago, the son of Dr. Palmer, it's enough to turn a Negro black. That's what Lou Palmer used to say in Chicago on the radio, the legend. But we're back with Margaret Edds. Margaret, when we left, you were talking about just the opposition. It is remarkable to think. I mean, you know, of course, in the wake of the Little Rock Nine, I mean, they don't have school in Arkansas for a year. I'm saying in Virginia, I mean, nobody goes to school. Why would you fight so hard? And but you know, you've walked us right up to the door of Brown. And of course, as I say, as you open the book, you bring another figure up who is far too not as well known as she should be, and that's of course Barbara Johns. Whose Uncle Vernon, of course, was the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before Martin Luther King, and they put him out for being a little too radical. But I mean, walk us through that assault on Jim Crow that leads us to Brown and then the aftermath, if you don't mind.
Well, Barbara Johns, fortunately, I think is about to get her due. She's going to be put in the statuary hall at the Capitol.
Yes.
Replacing Robert E. Lee there for Virginia. And a lot of work is being done about her history, things being created for teaching. So anyway, I'm really excited that that's happening.
And shout out to Kalita Nichols from Norfolk State, who has been part of that work as well. We've interviewed Kalita. We were old classmates. So I'm glad to hear that about Barbara Johns, though.
Yes, very exciting. Well, she, of course, led a student walkout in 1951 in Prince Edward County at the R.R. Moten School there, which was greatly overcrowded and poor conditions. And she planned this for a year, strategized it. It sort of came to her in a dream. She felt it was divinely inspired. And she was just very calm and led about it all and created a small group of students around her who planned this walkout. They kept it quiet. The day came, they had a strategy for getting the principal off campus, and then they sent out a notice to the teacher with his initials that everyone should come to the auditorium. And when they arrived, Barbara and her fellow students stood up and said, we're going to walk out. And so they did. And this went on. The next day, they contacted the Hill Robinson Law Firm in Richmond and asked them if they would come and help them. And of course, that was the point at which the NAACP was changing over to push for desegregation, not just separate and equal schools. And they did not think that Prince Edward County was the place they wanted to center one of these cases. But nonetheless, Hill and Robinson were headed out to Pulaski that day, and they thought, well, we'll stop by and we'll see the students and we'll thank them and tell them to go back to school. Well, when they got there, they were so amazed by the strength of the students and the resolve that they changed their minds. And they said, all right, if your parents will agree that we're going for desegregation, not just improve schools, then we will take this case. And so they did. And the rest is history. It became one of the 5 cases that combined into Brown v. Board.
Yes. And as you talked about in the first block, Spotswood Robinson's not only intellect, but his work ethic, to the point, as you write, that he works himself to exhaustion. I mean, really undergirds so much of those courtroom battles. Could you talk about the Brown battle and what happens in the aftermath, how they prep for it and those kinds of things? You even mentioned Kenneth and Mamie Clark. I mean, everybody in that, it seems like you got everybody into this book.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, it was really such a national undertaking. I mean, lawyers, people from all over the country combined to work on portions of it, to come up with strategies for it, to write out the legal language for it. And then they would come together in Washington and perfect that. And really a tribute to Spotswood Robinson that Thurgood Marshall asked him to give the final edit to that work and to have it in final form to go on to the Supreme Court. And such an indication of the trust that he had in him. And then Judge Robinson argued the Virginia portion of that case before the court. At the end of it, he was so exhausted that he almost had a physical breakdown, which was not known outside the inner circle at that point. But there was a fundraising letter that I found in the NAACP papers at the Library of Congress that went out saying that Spots has almost killed himself. We can't let this happen. And raising money for him to take extended vacation, which he did not take. But he did, I think, take a little bit of rest, but it was just not in his nature to feel that he could be away from the work. But nonetheless, it was an example of the physical toll that it took on these men, the work that they were doing. Of course, none of them made the kind of money that other professional or people in other professions were making, but they did have the reward of knowing that they were doing something so important for the nation and for the cause.
And we should probably pause here, if you don't mind, maybe helping us understand, because they end up helping you, particularly 2 children, Spotswood Robinson's daughter and Oliver Hill's son, but their spouses, their families. Of course, when we think about these heroic figures, they often get narrated as these kind of outsized individuals, but they really were part of communities, beginning with their families. Could you talk maybe a little bit about both of their families, their wives and children?
Yes. Both of them had very supportive wives. Bernie Hill was somewhat like the female version of her husband. She was very strong, and I have some letters from them in which she would chastise him if he wasn't being affectionate enough or present enough. But she was very committed to the cause and would go back up to Washington. She was working on a master's degree after she moved to Richmond. They had several years where they did not live together because he was here in Richmond establishing a practice and she was there teaching. As many families of that era, her teaching salary really helped sustain them. But at any rate, she was very involved in the cause. Miriam Robinson was her daughter and son-in-law described her as much more of a earth mother, really, that she kept Spots balanced because she just, he was so reserved and meticulous, and she was much more outgoing and warm, and I think added that to his nature, but also was extremely supportive of him and loving of him. They each had the Robinsons had 2 children, but one was deceased when I began my work. And the children were somewhat reflective of the parents. Oliver Hill Jr., who tragically died a couple of years ago during the pandemic of a heart attack, was just a wonderful person like his father. He was so gracious and so willing to be helpful. He was a quieter personality than his father, but could not have been more gracious and warm and welcoming. He was a psychology professor at Virginia State.
Absolutely. And well known and well respected. Did some very important work, but people should know more about Oliver Jr. on his own merits, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And hopefully will at some point. He was such a good spokesman for the cause that his father had worked on. Nina Robinson also was just very helpful to me, a little like her father. She was very cautious and wanted to make sure that everything was precise and correctly done. And so you could see the personality coming through there. But she had great insights about just stories that she told the day the Martinsville 7, which were 7 Black men who were convicted of rape in Martinsville and were executed, largest mass execution in American history, I believe. But she just recalled that day, at the time of the first execution, her father said, "We will all pause now," and everyone in the family was very quiet. And she said it was not that he thought that they were all innocent, because they probably weren't all, but he knew that the standard of justice was so different for Black people and white people, and that some of those men either participated very little or not at all. Yes. And it was just a travesty of justice.
Yes, in fact.
She also,
no, please, no, go for this.
Okay, she also recalled that once she was invited to a party for someone who was communist, and her father forbade her to go because he was so opposed to communism. I mean, one thing about these men that was so striking to me was that even with all they endured, they had such great faith in American institutions and in the promise of America. Yeah. A lot of, or some of that faith, I think, is no longer there with leaders, but they definitely felt that. Yes. They felt that that things would change and that the Constitution would undergird that change, and they kept going even when it was extraordinarily difficult.
And that is really, you talk about, we may have to ask you back to even de-layer such those complicated relationships, because of course Charles Houston, I think, probably would have been to the left in some ways of them, although he himself, of course, being a veteran of World War I. But I think about his relationship with William Patterson, who was an open communist. I mean, and you write about, of course, in terms of those tragic kind of executions that come in the wake of those convictions. You write about Odell Walker. I mean, and the fight for Odell Walker, which of course reminds us of Pauli Murray, and you see how they intervened even in the Murray case when she and her friend get caught in Virginia in those segregation situation. It's almost like there's a principle of operational unity. Even politics aside, we are going to unite to fight these wrongs. And yeah, I mean, it's aspirational for sure. But at the same time, it's almost as if in evoking those ideals, they transcend the reality that those ideals have never been met by this country. I mean, we call them American, but I'm not so sure if that framework can hold the weight of the convictions those cats had, But we want to.
One time that really came through for Mr. Hill was when he was going off to World War II, and he wrote to the woman in Roanoke who had been sort of a surrogate mother, and he said he really debated whether to go or not, because our white brethren, as he said, can be so despicable at times. But he decided that it was important for him to do that service so that when he could come back, he could continue the work that he had been doing. So they felt some of those strains as well, but they persisted, I think, in their faith that things could get to a better place.
Absolutely. We wouldn't be having this conversation if they hadn't made some progress on that. So that's absolutely the case. So we're going to come back in a second, everyone, with Margaret Edds, author of We Face the Dawn, and we're going to take a look at her next work, What the Eyes Can't See. We have followed with great interest politics in Virginia over the last few years, and of course, Governor Ralph Northam, the the blackface scandal and context, but Margaret Edds has traced that, and we're going to be reading about it soon in her new book. So we'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table to discuss that book and what's going on right now and next in national politics. Back in a moment.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
When you talk about blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
A lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it.
This is about covering us.
Invest in Black-owned media.
Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks.
We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Your money makes this possible.
Checks and money orders go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.
Can you believe the nerve of these Republicans? They only want to block progress for our community. They talk about cutting Medicare and Social Security. They played politics with veterans' health care. They voted against the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and funding for our HBCUs, and against lowering prescription drug costs for our seniors. These Republicans keep trying hard to stand in the way, but President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Democrats won't let them. They are delivering for us. The Democratic National Committee is responsible for the content of this advertising.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network in every way. And we are joined today with Margaret Edds, author of We Face the Dawn and many other books. And when we left, Margaret, we were talking about this aspiration to create a better society. And thank you, by the way, when you all read We Face the Dawn, you'll see in the aftermath of these victories, as you said, the attempt to disbar these men, the attempt to shut down the NAACP, even shutting the schools, but change is inevitable. And I'm wondering, before we turn to your new book, if you might say a word about the role of the press in this struggle. Because, I mean, as a journalist and as a craftsperson, and you keep saying retired, but clearly you're not, because you keep writing. You write about the Norfolk Journal and Guide and the Richmond News Leader. And as a journalist yourself, reading through these archives and listening and talking to these elders, some of whom waged this war, how important was the Black press and the press generally in this struggle?
Well, again, the Black press, which struggled, as all presses do today, but to, even stay alive, was another force that was supportive and was getting the stories out. And it was so important to me in doing the research that I did. I mean, I decided early on that I probably would not find a whole lot of the real story in the Richmond Times-Dispatch or the Richmond News Leader or the main white dailies. But in going to the Afro-American newspaper, I was able to glean so much information. I mean, that really was a bedrock of the reporting that I was able to do, as were the papers at the Library of Congress, the NAACP papers there. But the Black press was pivotal in my being able to understand and find some of the details of the cases that these people were bringing. The white press was a mixed bag. Of course, in Richmond, we had the legacy of really strong support from, and the work that was done to sort of give the intellectual basis for massive resistance and really terrible pushback on any movement toward improvement in civil rights. But we also did have the editorial page of the Virginian Pilot, where I've spent most of my career, and I was very proud that that paper won a Pulitzer Prize for its work in opposition to massive resistance. So the white press was something of a mixed bag, but the black press was essential for historians to go back and look at what the true stories were, what was going on.
Thank you. And of course, here at the Black Star Network, that resonates particularly. I can hear Roland Martin right now saying, yes, this is what he's always talking about. Spent his whole career as a black newspaper man. So he understands, and certainly that helps us. So let's turn to the work that you've completed that we are eagerly anticipating diving into. I'm going to have to ask you back to discuss What the Eyes Can't See, Ralph Northam, Black Resolve, and a Racial Reckoning in Virginia, soon to be out with the University of South Carolina Press. What led you to that book? Now, you wrote that book during the pandemic.
I did. I really thought that the book on Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson would be the last one I'd do, because I spent portions of 6 years working on that, and I'm 75 now. I wasn't sure that I had 6 years left.
You're young, you know how that is.
But at any rate, I guess, when Governor Northam at the time, announced in the wake of George Floyd that he was going to take down the Lee statue in Richmond, I just thought, what a powerful story. That here is this man who was almost booted from office over the picture in his medical school yearbook, 35 years old, but nonetheless, a picture of a man in blackface and someone else in a Ku Klux Klan robe. And it was such a shocking image to the people who had supported him that virtually every national Democratic politician of note called on him to resign. He did not, partially because of luck, because it turned out that two Democratic officials, Lieutenant Governor and Attorney General behind him, had some issues of their own.
Well, I'd like to ask you, actually, I hope, do you in the book address that? I'm thinking about Justin Fairfax, who has been crying for justice, who's been screaming for investigations, was accused of sexual assaults, and has said, please investigate, and couldn't get any traction from black women DAs in North Carolina or Massachusetts. And who is now apparently, we're seeing reporters saying there was a rush to judgment there. And he, of course, and Doug Wilder has said some things as well, talking about the black mayor of Richmond and Northam, almost as if there was a hit job. Terry McAuliffe denies it, but I'm wondering if you talk about any of that in the book.
Well, I don't in any depth. I just talk about the fact that it occurred, and I haven't done enough personal reporting about it to want to say anything about what my opinion is.
I just wanted to know, because I'm thinking about that now, because it has resurfaced again. But please continue. So Northam, in the wake of this, do you open the book with the monuments coming down?
Yes. I opened the book actually with a blackface scandal, just a couple of days around that, and but he also has this real tenacity in his personality of not giving up. And so he just decided, partly on his own and partly through conversations with some black leaders like Senator Jennifer McClellan or Delegate Dolores McQuinn, Delegate McQuinn particularly was among those who did not want him to resign the night that everyone was calling for his resignation. She's a minister, and I guess she's spent her life trying to make lemonade out of lemons, you might say. Mm-hmm. And so she just urged him to take this moment. She said, you have access to places that I cannot go. You can take this and turn this to something good and something important. Yes. And so he spent much of the next months really focusing on things that he had never thought much about. And an interesting fact about him is that he probably had the most integrated childhood of any previous Virginia governor, because when the schools desegregated on the Eastern Shore, his parents kept him in the public schools, which for people of their economic class was not a guarantee. And he has one of those people who could genuinely say, I have a lot of black friends. Yeah. He actually did. Now, another point to be made is, had they had these deep conversations about systemic racism and the impact of racism on their lives? No, they had not. Mm. But many of those people came to his defense when others were calling on him to resign. So I looked at this story as an example of a 59-year-old white man who grew up in the rural South, who really had his eyes opened to systemic racism. And I saw this as perhaps a model or a pattern that others who cared to do so could follow. I still see it that way. I'm somewhat less optimistic that it's going to be universally heard because, we're living in the era we're living in. But those people who care to learn and care to grow, I think will find some things in it. And the title comes from his telling medical school students for many years, if you don't know about a diagnosis, even if it's staring you right in the face, you won't see it. And the same thing for racism. If you don't really understand racism and understand the impact that it's had on our country, you won't see it. You'll say, my life is fine. I'm not racist. What? But you really have to have those deep conversations. And you really have to look at the inequities in our society and ask why. Why do these occur? Why do Black and brown people at almost every indicator of social well-being come in behind whites? Why is that? Is it because they're inferior? Is it because of overt racism? Or is it because there's structures built into our culture and our society that have led to those outcomes? And that's my belief, and that's the belief that he came to. And that's what I hope to make the case for in the book.
That's remarkable. I mean, I think we've come full circle to where we started. Those battles that generation, 2 generations of lawyers fought, residential segregation and segregation in all forms, education, American life. Margaret, having researched and written across the arc of really American history, certainly the 20th century, and having lived enough of the moments of transition and sitting here now looking forward, where do you think we're going to go next? I mean, as you say, you quote Gary Orfield extensively, and We Face the Dawn, and he's got a new book out where he says not only is the place more segregated than before, the inequities are deeper. I mean, I wonder, what do you think happens next?
Well, it's very dispiriting, and I don't think there's any way to look at the situation without that. But I try to look at the world that Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson and their contemporaries lived in. And I really don't think we're facing anything more difficult than they faced. And they found a way to persevere and push forward. Did they solve things for all times? Obviously, they did not. But they really pushed the ball forward. And I really think that's all that any of us have to do. We just have to move the metric a bit to the best of our ability. And I think that potential still exists. I think after George Floyd, we saw that there are people in this country who are open to understanding that. And now maybe we're dialing back, or maybe the opposing forces are having a louder voice. But those people are still there. And I think progress can still be made. And, we can't expect to create a perfect world, but we can expect to keep trying and perhaps to move the metric a bit. That's the challenge. I mean, Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson knew change is inevitable. Change always happens. So nothing is ever static, and you just have to keep trying to find ways to make some degree of positive change.
Absolutely. That's what the great writer Octavia Butler would say. Change is the constant. We just have to shape it. That's all. And in the words that you take the title of We Face the Dawn from, of course, the great Paul Dunbar, whose name still is on the school. Shout out to Nubia Garima and all the young people at the Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School here in D.C., Charles Hampton, Houston, of course, a graduate of Dunbar. I love that poem you draw from Paul Dunbar when he says, I greet the dawn and not the setting sun when all is done. So yeah, we just gonna greet the dawn. We're gonna keep greeting it. Thank you so much, Margaret, for joining us. And thank you for this work, for your continuing career. I mean, with all due respect, all these people keep coming on this show and talking about they retired and say, y'all can't spell retirement. And I hate to say it to a journalist, but you just can't spell it. But thank you. And we look forward to not only having you over at Howard again soon, but for folks really learning a lot and continue to learn not only from these two books, but from your other work as well. Thank you for joining.
Well, thank you for your work also, and for keeping these stories alive.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll talk again with you soon. We'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table. We're going to clear the table and get ready for our next session. Back in a moment.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol,
We're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate Black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr. We've been joined for the last hour by Margaret Edds, author of We Face the Dawn and author of the forthcoming What the Eyes Can't See. We've had a really rich and powerful conversation. And as we were listening to Margaret, one of the things that occurred to me was a question that I often find myself thinking about as we have these kind of conversations. What if apartheid had not been a thing? In other words, what if these women and men, what if Constance Baker Motley and Pauli Murray, what if Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and William Patterson and so many others, what if Robert Carter and what if all of the lawyers who argued Brown versus Boyd, what if John Hope Franklin and Kenneth Mamie Clark and all the scholars who came together to destroy Jim Crow with their scholarly contributions, what if they hadn't had to face that? What if they had not had to face killing apartheid and a thing that continues to persist in what Carter Woodson called the sequel to slavery? What if they had not done that? What could their intellects and talents have been applied to? Well, then another thought occurs. Perhaps because of the thing they had to face, the work that they did gives us a model for what the best of humanity can be when confronted with the worst impulses of humanity. So in that respect, when you read a book like We Face the Dawn, you're introduced to people who not only give us a model for how to struggle for a Black community, but ultimately how to pull the best of the human condition out of the worst of circumstances and give us a model for how to live and be in the world. And it's truly a testament to the best in what we can be as human beings. And that's not a lesson for America. That's not a lesson for any country. That's a lesson for a species. So we're grateful to Margaret Edds for joining us today and giving us a little bit of a roadmap to listen to these ancestors who can teach us a little bit about being human in the world when faced with conditions that we need to change. So join us next week. We'll be back at the Black Table. We are grateful for your support the Black Star Network, and we'll see you soon.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
When you talk about Blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it.
This is about covering us.
Invest in Black-owned media.
Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks.
We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Your money makes this possible.
Take some money orders. Go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is rolling@RolandSMartin.com.